All right, here we are again with another Malazan discussion. You see my good friend AP Canavan here, so you know it's probably going to be a Malazan discussion, right? And we are doing something a little different. So AP, I recently had a discussion with you, recently as in like half an hour ago, about a poem, a Malazan poem, which is usually my shtick. I like to do the poems, right? And you are known, and if you guys don't know this already, AP does some really, really brilliant prologue analyses. He's got for every single Malazan book, is that correct?
Mhm.
Every single one that we've covered so far, he has some really, I think, insightful prologue analyses on his channel. So we're going to do a little prologue analysis on my channel now. So we're going to just keep things interesting, keep us on our toes. He got the poem, I got the prologue this time. So that's what we're doing, right, AP?
Well, it seemed only fair. I stole something from you, you steal this right back.
Yeah, it's a nice kind of stealing, I suppose. But we are doing a little bit of more of a general, more general than what you usually do on your channel, which can be a very close reading. We're going to have a sort of general analysis of the prologue of Reaper's Gale, that is book 7 of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. There will be no spoilers beyond the prologue of Reaper's Gale. And of course, AP and I will be having our usual non-spoiler and spoiler discussion of a Malazan book. So the Reaper's Gale discussion will be happening soon, folks. But we're just having fun with these poems and prologues, and there's just so much to talk about in a Malazan book, isn't there?
And it's why when people talk about you need to reread, there's no need to reread the Malazan Book of the Fallen. However, when you reread the Malazan Book of the Fallen,
Yeah.
there is so much there that you might have missed the first time around. Because
Oh
quite
yeah.
often, when we first read something, we're galloping through it to find out what happens next. We don't have the context for a lot of things that are going on, and you kind of want to get on to the next point to find out what's the next big thing.
Yeah.
And why rereading the Malazan Book of the Fallen is so much fun and so interesting is suddenly you have all of this context. You're very familiar with Erickson's style. You're familiar now with the world. You're not feeling that pressure to find out what is going to happen next. And you take a much more relaxed stance going through it. And suddenly, because you have that relaxation, because you're just engaging with it and being more immersed in it, you actually pick up so much more. And that's why this series is just so much fun to have these close looks at some of the things that are going on, because there's a lot worked into the language. Erickson's prose is wonderfully complicated, dense, layered, textured. There's a lot in there that is just fun to investigate.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's rich. And it is a series that I imagine I will be rereading several times in the future and picking up new things every single time. But this prologue, so like I said, there will be spoilers only for the prologue of Reaper's Gale, but we might refer to things that happened in previous books in the series, particularly Midnight Tides. But the prologue begins with this absolutely cataclysmic scene. I mean, just whoo. I mean, Erickson is brilliant at these cataclysmic scenes. This seeming apocalypse here, with dragon carcasses strewn over the landscape, and all of this stuff. And we're in this clearly a realm that has been ripped asunder, and it has been destroyed. It is adrift. It is a place that is in serious trouble, to put it mildly. And what we have here is in a way, you hear about Curled Emerlane so much in the earlier books. And what you get here is a bit of an origin of how, just not quite exactly, but you get the closest glimpse thus far into what happened to Curled Emerlane, right?
And I think if the Warrens were ever up for sale, Curled Emerlane's the one that the estate agent would describe as a bit of a fixer-upper.
Yeah.
Um, but Curled Emerlane, we've heard in previous books about the sundering of Curled Emerlane. We've
Hmm.
heard about the fragments of shadow.
Yeah.
And now we're getting a real sense of this is what happened to it. And all of those pieces from previous prologues, all of those little references to mythic instances, suddenly this prologue, because it is a continuation of the one in Midnight Tides. And this is the first time there's that sort of direct continuation of a almost like a parallel narrative.
Yeah.
But here we have that sense of continuity. We are now placing it. We've picked up all of these different pieces and clues that we never knew what order they went in. We never knew how to sort of clip them together. And this is part and parcel of the storytelling techniques that Erikson likes to employ. That you'd have all of these pieces, but now we're getting the context of how they fit together. And retrospectively, we can think back to the prologue of Midnight Tides. We can think back to some of the observations people have made about Shadow, about Curled Emerald,
Yeah.
and go, now I understand. And it recontextualizes a lot of the information from previous books. So
Yeah.
this, when we heard about the Sundering, it sounded grand. It sounded, yes, cataclysmic, but it was very hard to picture. And now we get this very physical and very visceral sense of a realm being torn to pieces, literally war torn. And that literalization of the metaphor that we can get in science fiction and fantasy.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really quite something. And it leads me to wonder why Curled Emerlane, of all the warrens, the realms that we see in the Malazan series, and all of them. I wonder why Erikson and Esselmont chose this particular one to be the one that it plays an interesting role through, I think, all the books, doesn't it? I mean, it's crucial in some ways. It is that realm in between light and darkness. And it seems to be, in a way, what is it that we human beings inhabit? We inhabit the place in between light and darkness, don't we, during this brief period when we're alive? And the fact that it is so torn up and that it is so chaotic and so disjointed and all of that. Is it an accident that they chose Curled Emerlane, do you think, AP?
Oh yeah, it's a stunning coincidence that the position between two fixed absolute points of light, which is a fixed abstract, and absolute darkness, which is a fixed abstract. These are absolutes and cannot change. And what is the realm that has the ability to change? What is the realm that is mutable? Shadow, the place between them, because it is the spectrum that runs between these two fixed points. So where can change happen? It happens in the grayness. It happens in the darker aspects of the grayness, the lighter aspects of the grayness. It runs the gamut of everything. So change can happen, mutability can happen. And all of this is because shadow is flexible. Shadow bends. Shadow fills all of these different spaces. Whereas darkness is one thing. Light is another thing. And shadow has that ability to move and change and grow.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's an absolute coincidence that Erikson and Esselmont chose this as the sort of the commanding warren that is going to be so impactful on the mortal realm.
Yeah. And even, of course, Shadow Throne and Cotillion setting up shop in Curled Emerlane and thinking of, at least outwardly, maybe they're wise enough to know better, but there are plenty of hints throughout the books thus far that it may not be so much that they are the masters of this realm. That might be a bit grandiose to describe their exact position in relation to Curled Emerlane. Would you agree with that?
Well, and again, it's an absolute coincidence that humans who think of themselves as masters of everything, even when we only have a fractional understanding of our own planet, could be so blindingly wrong about things. Again, startling coincidence. But yeah, it's exactly this, that one of the things I recently talked to Esselmont about was how when you have a fixed conflict where you have two sides that cannot agree, sometimes you need an external third party to come in and mediate.
Yeah.
And where you have elder gods, where you have these positions and these realms that are fixed and these personalities have been fixed for so long,
Yeah.
what is the agent of change here? And it's the young upstart mortals who ascended and had the temerity, who had the audacity to intervene in these things, to go, you know what, we don't like the situation, something new has to be done. This has been going on, as we know from these prologues, for hundreds of thousands of years.
Yeah.
Shadow Throne and Cotillion rock up and go, oh, right, let's get started on this then. Because only a young race, only a mortal race has that sense of urgency. And that is such an alien perspective to so many of these grand or even grandiose powers.
Yeah.
Because they look at things and they go, well, what's the difference of a Hugh millennium? And Shadow Throne and Cotillion are going, well, it matters a lot to the people on the ground, doesn't it? And it is that different perspective. It's a different way of looking at it. It's a way of mediating these ancient conflicts.
So you're saying that Shadow Throne and Cotillion are like 13-year-olds?
Yeah.
So the first epic figure that we meet, and this particular elder goddess, is not named until the very end of that first part of we're going to talk about the first 3 sections of the prologue. There are 5 sections to the prologue. We're going to talk about the first 3 only, and these are the ones that take place way back when, in epic time. Okay, so the other 2 are actually much closer to the time of the story. So we're not going to talk about those. Just the 3 that are just way back when, that relate to the stuff that was going on in the prologue of Midnight Tides, where you had, just to remind folks, you had the betrayal of Silkus Ruin by Scabandari Blood Eye, and that whole thing after the conflict against the Kachane Chamal. So this is very much in relation to that. And recall also, everyone, that at the end of that prologue, you also had Male having a conversation involving Gothos and asking Gothos for a favor, which involved Ontos Falak, right? Freezing everything in this particular continent. So that's just sort of context and relating to where we are now. And the first one we meet here is none other than Anamandarus, who is introduced with these bruised, bloody, huge hands. And what has she been doing? She's been beating up somebody here, right? I mean,
well, and the suggest she's well, let's back up a little tiny bit,
sure.
Because obviously following through this opening scene, because we're going to go through these three scenes,
Yeah.
but in this opening scene, her name is not revealed until the very end,
Right?
And this is something that Erikson does a lot in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. It is something that I've spoken about. I've spoken about previously, that it is a habit of his that on my first read used to frustrate me. On this read, it hasn't, on this reread, it hasn't been a frustration at all, and I've greatly appreciated it.
It really works with this scene, actually. It really works with this scene.
And I was thinking back to even when I was reading it the first time, when occasionally it was frustrating, because what it made me do was I would get to the end of the scene and go, oh, right, that, and then I would go back and reread it. And thinking about it now, I think a lot of that was very, very deliberate on Erikson's part to make you do that, to try and force you to do that. Of course, you know, us being readers, what we did was we just skipped to the end, found out who it was, and then just read through, because we cheat.
Guilty. Yeah.
But so this is one of those sequences where there is a mysterious figure and it builds up, and then it is revealed at the end, the name is dropped.
Right.
And that's when you suddenly make the connection between this scene and the prologue of Midnight Tides,
Right.
because we knew that this was going to happen. This was referred to in that prologue. And now we go, oh, so this is Anamandarus. And what I find fascinating about the description, she's described as having sun-bleached, bone-colored skin.
Yeah.
And there's only one other race described that way.
Yeah.
And then she's also described as having additional joints.
Yeah.
And again, the eagle-eyed amongst us might have gone, that seems familiar.
Yeah.
And so where we see Kilmandarus appear, where she has these bloody hands and she's been fighting something,
Yeah.
the implication that Kilmandarus is the god of the Forkal Assail.
Right. Right.
And this is this wonderful little reminder, because these are a mysterious, powerful race that we know nothing about, really.
So far. Yeah.
And so this has been this wonderful sort of moment of revelation. So it has this deep world building aspect, this deep lore aspect,
Yeah.
this mythic past that, again, we're being given more and more context each time. It's
Right.
being doled out in these little tiny drips over time.
Yeah, the only time we met a Forkal Assail in the series thus far, up to book 7, was in House of Chains, when one of them beat the crap out of Karsa and his two buddies. And they seem quite formidable from that encounter, don't they? But yeah, she is described that way, and she is really nobody you want to mess with. That's for sure. Yeah, I mean, she seems to be quite fierce, and the fact that she may be the person responsible for these dragon carcasses.
And this again goes to one of the techniques, obviously, that Erickson uses, which is a lot of implied connection and a lot of subtext,
right.
heavily leading you in one direction in interpretation. So again, thinking back to Midnight Tides,
Yeah.
what do we know about what happened to Scabandari Bloodeye? And we know that he, in the prologue, had flown off holding Silkus Ruin in his claws. And at that point in the prologue, Mail had said, we're going to go after him. We're going to sort him out. And Kilmandarus was mentioned. And then later on, the Sengar brothers enter the Stone Bowl, where they find the skull of a dragon that has had its head punched in by some powerful physical blow.
Right.
And now, in this opening passage, this opening scene, Kilmandarus is striding through the carcasses of dead dragons. Her hands are bruised and bloody from clearly punching things.
Yeah.
And so this is this element of foreshadowing, of subtextual information and implied information going, how did Silkus Ruin die? Killed by Scabandari Bloodeye. What happened to Scabandari Bloodeye? Kilmandarus caught up with him and punched him in the head.
Yeah.
And it's all, you see this whole chain developing, and it's being fed to us little bits at a time, and the information is there for us to pick up on.
Yeah, I love how they do, both authors do that in the Malazan books, and you get a sense that there are certain elder gods that are related to certain of the races. You get a sense for that as you read along. So Kilmandarus and the Forkal Assail, and you have others who might be associated with other races, but it's never quite just a linear thing, is it? There's always some kind of ambiguity about it, and even without getting into specifics, questions about ancestry and who's related to who and just how. Well,
and this is the thing. Try and explain the lineage of the Olympian gods.
Exactly. Yeah.
And you go, oh, that's really easy. Hang on a sec. So hang on, that brother to, well, and also son, and then first cousin twice removed by marriage. Okay, yeah. Anytime we think of these mythic histories, these legendary pantheons, you suddenly, it's never quite as simple as we remember, because as soon as you start digging into it, there are lots of ephemeral stories and lesser known stories that give us sometimes quite contradictory information about the characters.
Right.
So seeing that replicated here, people may complain that it is not clear, that it's not crystal clear, and why can't I have an exact family tree drawn out? And you have the same problem when we think of the Greek gods.
Precisely. Precisely. Yeah. It's messy. It's messy because, of course, what they duplicated here is this sense of the accumulation of centuries of tradition that goes into the formation of these myths. And you have variants, and because people are messy, and there are various versions of these different figures and so on and so forth. So it's really cool. So do we want to leave Kilmandaros behind for the moment and go into the second chunk of the
Yep.
prologue here? Okay. So here is where we have Gothos and Male having a bit of a discourse. And Gothos has finished with his ritual, which is, of course, him being a Jagat is definitely Omtos Falak. And he has performed an important thing. And if you've read Midnight Tides, I think you have a pretty good idea what Gothos did and the impact that it had for thousands and thousands and thousands of years on this particular portion of the Malazan world, where there was a certain kind of freezing of certain aspects of for example, religion and that sort of thing, or magic. It's a much older form of magic with the holds versus the warrens that evolved in other places, and so on and so forth. So that ritual that Gothos performed here had a big effect, didn't it?
Yeah, and there are a couple of different ways of looking at this. Unsurprisingly, I'm going to suggest there's a couple of different ways of looking at this.
Yeah.
So we can take the literal. Gothos performed a ritual with Omtos Falak that created and froze these moments in time, and then, because if you think, one of the things that we have seen time and time again in the Malazan world is that death, life, blood sacrifice, all of these things are powerful. Yeah. And of course, Gothos is standing there. We have seen the Kachin Chamal armies wiped out, the Tisandi army basically wiped out and then betrayed, and the rest of the survivors wiped out. The Tist Eater, a lot of them had died. He's standing next to an elder god who has their own power. We know that this is all part and parcel of, there's a rent in the distance where another realm is leaking into this one. This is a time of tumultuous change and power. When Gothos enacts his ritual, he's very, very powerful. But think of the amount of power that's there. Did he intend quite the full extent of what happened? Or was this more powerful than he maybe thought that it was going to be?
Interesting, yeah.
And so instead of it just freezing this aspect, it actually had ramifications across the sort of metaphysical realms and impacted other realms in and around it. So that's one way of sort of thinking about this. Of course, we see the far more prosaic aspects where we see there was an ice age. Right. There were these beings frozen in ice and in these glaciers. That there is that very literal, very prosaic and mundane aspect to it. But that metaphysical aspect, I think, is the very, very interesting one. And of course, the third way to think about it is, yes, this is Erikson literalizing a metaphor about, I want to have a civilization that is kind of frozen in time. So I will literally have someone freeze it in time. It plays into that thematic construct that we had with both the Eater falling into almost like a prehistoric past, the Letheri being locked into a colonial outpost past and idea, and losing a sense of themselves and just being locked in time.
Yeah, brilliant. And before we get to Kilmandaros showing up and pounding the crap out of Scabandari Bloodeye, which is what happens in that section as well, because he's been cornered, I guess. But before we get there, I find these Jagats so interesting, and they're so quirky. Of course, you've met Raced. It was the first Jagat you met. If Gardens of the Moon was the first Malazan book you ever read, Raced was the first one. You might have gotten I think a misperception of Jagats if that was your first encounter, because they're so quirky. I mean, they might even seem harmless because of how just weird they are, but they do have this very obviously great power, as Gothos exhibits here in the prologue, with this ability to freeze, aspects of a continent. That's a pretty vast power at play there. But at the same time, they're of course, there are things about them I can't say too, because they're in other parts of other series, obviously. But I just find this Gothos fellow, and about Gothos that he has this. We've already talked about this in previous books. He has this ongoing suicide note that he's writing.
Well, he's writing Gothos Folly. That's the
Right.
name of this long tome that's now extended into multiple editions.
Right.
Oh, I wonder where the author of a Decalogue got that idea of the idea of writing one story that's going to extend across multiple editions.
Yeah.
Again, stunning coincidence. But Gothos continually writing, trying to get all of his thoughts down on paper.
Yeah.
When we try to do that, we suddenly realize how complex it is, and one thought naturally leads to another thought, which leads to another thought. So it's an ongoing process. And so Gothos, his folly, the idea of trying to encapsulate everything, that's why he's still there, still writing. But again, the Jagat they're so fascinating, because when we saw that prologue in Memories of Ice, and it's the opening of the Jagat Imas War, and you have whatever it was, like about 12 Imas hunting down 3 Jagat, a mother and 2 children, 2 babies, and that was the war. And what was their rationale for it? Well, Raist had been a Jagat tyrant. He was an exception. He was a danger. He did horrible things.
Right.
And so the Imas's rationale is the danger of that happening again means that we will enact a genocide. And until then, we've been very sympathetic to the Imas. And because Raist was our first contact with the Jagat, we were, well, maybe the Imas had a point.
Yeah.
But suddenly we saw it from the other side. And this, again, is something that both Erikson and Esmond play with, the multiple perspectives of a conflict, of trying to understand different positions different from our own. And here, we get to meet another Jagat, and we actually get a bit of a conversation with him. We get a sense of Gothos' quite dry sense of humor, that he is immensely powerful. He talks to elder gods without sort of any sort of deference, and oh God, them. His attitude to them is not one that inspires a lot of reverence towards them. His attitude, oh, you guys again. And we realize then that is the power of at least some of the Jagat. And so you can understand the fear that the Imas had, and why they made that decision to enact the ritual of Talan.
Right.
Because when you're faced with someone that powerful, what would you do? What if they went bad? What if they became a tyrant? What could you possibly do? So again, it adds that complexity. Gothos, I think, is a great character, and I enjoy reading him. Yeah. But it again casts the Imas's decision in further light.
Yeah. It's so much of what the Jagat are, and they seem to be kind of a subversion of troll or orc-like creatures in so many ways, because they're so intelligent. You can see their intelligence in every encounter, and how they seem to turn their back on a lot of things that we humans prize, and they're very different in that respect. So they represent the opposite of humanity in some ways, I would say, but in ways that you are so unexpected, and that give us such revelations about ourselves and what motivates us, and maybe certain strains within humanity also are in agreement with the Jagat as well.
Well, and it's interesting you raised that. Niffle Rogue did a video that he actually made a very convincing argument. I'm fairly sure it was Niffle Rogue. It might have been Ruthen Bad.
It sounds like a Niffle Rogue thing, because he is a Jagat. Yeah.
But it could have been Ruthen Bad, or it could have been Niffle Rogue.
They're both very smart, so yeah.
They're both very smart, and they both do excellent analysis videos and essays. And the argument that I remember, at least one of them making, was that the Jagat were the personification of the ultimate individualists.
Yes.
They
Yes.
are entirely isolated in the individual,
Yeah.
whereas the Imas were the articulation of
The
the
group.
collective.
Yeah. Yeah.
And humans fall somewhere between. Again, this idea of having these absolute positions,
Yeah.
but it's that median between them. It's the middle ground between them, the shadow. Not all light, not all dark, not all good, not all evil. That
Yeah.
mixture in between that allows for change and mutability.
That's why we're so messy. So great. Well, so she beats the crap out of Scabandari and smashes in his skull, and they get his. This is revealed in here, right?
Yeah.
What they do with him. Okay, I don't want to do any
So
spoilers.
Gothos captures Scabandari's power in a finist.
Right, his soul.
Because that was the agreement he had made with the elder gods, and he said,
Yes.
"We'll work out my payment later."
Yeah.
He captures it in the finist, so his soul, his spirit, his energy, his power,
Yeah.
and then said, "And my payment is this finist. Thank you very much."
Bye. Clever.
And again, remember we've been having chats about like the trickster and things like that. That
Yeah.
this is a slightly different way of doing a trickster figure. But again, it's not playing the trick. It's using your intellect to solve something rather than a direct conflict. Kilmandaros, you're not going to fight for something.
No.
But tricking her is potential. And that you can see that that is a nice play there. That so often we think about how powerful are they? Who would win in a fight? If they were facing off against each other, who would win? You know, talking about power levels and all of this sort of thing. And you go, that's one way of looking at it. But
Right.
the other is thinking about it in terms of like this, where it's using your intellect to solve the problem.
Yeah.
And tricking someone into getting you the thing that you want.
Yeah. Huh. So then another encounter happens in the third part of the prologue, which is the last part we're going to discuss of the 5 parts. These are the 3 that take place in ancient times. Kilmandaros leaves and encounters a new figure, none other than our boy Anamandarus Rake. And this is an interesting discussion that takes place between the two, because you might be surprised by the way Anamander reacts to everything that has taken place and how disinterested he seems to be in the fate of the person who betrayed his brother, right?
Yeah, and Anamandarus Rake, as he gets called here. So again, we have that wonderful, we all recognize the name, we recognize the character. And we've seen this before about using those little hints about linguistic change over time, which adds such a minor but yet vital sense of verisimilitude. Well, I had to work in the word verisimilitude at least once.
Oh, yeah.
But it adds this authenticity to everything, because we know that we can look back on things. You, as a scholar of Anglo-Saxon, can find Anglo-Saxon words that are still modern day words. Are they pronounced the same way?
Not usually, no.
And you go, there can be a completely different pronunciation, or we have words that have their root in that Anglo-Saxon word, and you can recognize it, and you go, oh, I can see if you sort of squint at it and tilt your head a bit and maybe, tweak it a little, it's the same word. Yeah. Or meanings shift over time. All of this happens all the time in our world. And little moments like that in the text, I think, are these wonderful representations of that. And it makes it feel much more lived in. It makes it feel as if these years actually happened. Wow. And it's one of those tricks that both Erikson and Esmond do that I think is just such a wonderful little addition. And it's so minor, and yet it has such a powerful effect.
Yeah, a lot of us Old English scholars have crooked heads because we're always tilting them.
It makes translation easier. But I think you raised a really interesting point about Rake, because Rake here does seem different to the Rake that we saw in Gardens of the Moon. He does seem different to the Rake that we saw in Memories of Ice. Mm-hmm. And for part of it, he does seem much colder, much more reptilian, much more draconic. And if we think of, again, that opening prologue to Midnight Tides, the descriptions of Silkus Ruin and the descriptions of Scabandari Blood-Eye, the cold-blooded nature of what they were doing and how they related, everything being emphasized about this sort of draconic element.
Right.
And one of the things that Anamander mentions is soul taken, that this is, you know, there are a bunch of soul taken running around. It seems, again, the implication is this is a relatively new development. When we meet Anamander in Gardens of the Moon and Memories of Ice, it is hundreds of thousands of years later. I think he's eased his way into it. He's kind of gotten used to it. He's gotten back to being closer to his old self. Right now, you get the impression that this is a much more new thing, and this is an alien way of thinking. And it just seems that much colder.
Yeah. I was thinking that maybe it's because of his perspective as a creature of longevity that we can't even conceive of as humans. But this is the Age of Sundering. That's the only description we have of the time period here. The Age of Sundering. Pretty cool, actually, isn't it? But so we don't know how long he's been around. We don't know how long he's been. In fact, it would seem, based on what's happening, and when you relate it to the previous prologue in Midnight Tides, that this was basically the time when the Teist peoples were emerging into the world of the story of the Malazan. I keep calling it the Malazan world, but I don't know what else to call it. But the Malazan world, it wasn't the Malazan world then, obviously, but it was the world that the Malazan Empire would eventually emerge in. So they're relatively new, I think, to this place, and we don't know how long he's been draconian, how long he's been soul taken, and all of that. So I like your explanation a lot. The idea that he's more draconian right now because he's relatively recently come into this power. So that makes a lot of sense in terms of his reaction to, because even what's her name? Kilmandarus. Yeah, Kilmandarus is a little bit surprised. Don't you want vengeance for your brother? And he's like, no, so.
Well, it's more that he went, but I knew you guys would handle it.
Yeah.
And it's that cold logical calculation. And when we compare, like, if you contrast that to in Gardens of the Moon, when he is talking to Baruch, and he's like, I'm trying to find a reason to give my people so that they will feel alive.
Yeah.
Look at how that difference, that contrast.
Yeah.
And I think that is just so wonderfully illustrative of how he has changed as a character over time.
Yeah.
Well, that we're getting a glimpse at a much, much younger character here.
Interesting. Dare I say he feels more human in Gardens of the Moon?
Or humane, if but yeah, it is this interesting thing. He's spending time in the mortal realm, spending time with people. We can see that maybe this is the effect that he was looking for, a way to warm them up, a way to let them feel life again. Yeah. So we can see if you've been pursuing that for centuries, it must have some effect on you. But I did like that this Rake is much more dangerous seeming, much more ruthless seeming, because we know he's powerful. Like that's a given. But power in the hands of someone ruthless and someone cold and someone pragmatic can be absolutely frightening.
Yeah.
And Rake comes across here as quite a sinister figure in some small regards.
Yeah. Cool. As you might at first see him in Gardens of the Moon, when he's up on Moonspawn and appears as this almost like archetypal villain, sort of very dramatic with the wind in his hair and the unleashing of all that power and all that. But then there's that scene with Baruch, like you said, where he's so humanized. So great. Anything else you want to say about these three chunks of the prologue?
Well, the last thing I would bring up is something we've kind of mentioned before, but this is the deep history of the world, the mythological making of the world, the metaphysical underpinnings of the world. a lot of readers have this desire to find out about the magic, find out how these things came to pass, to delve into the history that in Tolkien, we talk about his legendarium. We talk about the mythos created by Tolkien. Here, this is the same sort of thing, that we're getting glimpses into this mythic past. And because of what we've seen previously, we know these things will have ripples in the present. The past is always connected to where we are. And so this focus on war and betrayal, we've seen these things in previous books. This is setting up a tone, as well as giving us that wonderful glimpse of the mythic nature and the legends that formed this world.
Yeah, brilliant. Great stuff. Yeah, I mean, and it is so important. Those layers are so important to, I think, our experience of the present in the story as well. They really do flesh it out beautifully and make this such a compelling world. So it's really fun to delve into those layers sometimes. And I thank you, my good friend, for joining me for this discussion. It's kind of cool to do prologue analyses, isn't it?
Yeah, it's so cool. I might have to do a couple of videos on them.
Yeah, I suspect that you're going to have a lot more to say, not only about the two sections that follow, but you're probably going to have to run back over these three a little bit in more detail, I think. Yeah.
One or two minor points. That's it.
Okay. Fair enough. All right. Thank you, my friend. And thank you to all our viewers for watching us have our fun. And I hope you enjoyed it as well.